Hello and welcome to Sleepsmyth, your peaceful place to unwind, dream, and drift gently into sleep. Before we start our story tonight, let me help you settle in with a simple, calming breath like a gentle lullaby for your body and mind. So, find a cozy spot, maybe snuggle under your blanket, and softly close your eyes. Now, breathing quietly through your nose for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold that breath softly for 7 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And now, slowly exhale through your mouth for 8 seconds, letting all the tension melt away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's do that again. Nice and easy. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. One last time, just like a soft whisper, breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Feel your body getting lighter, your mind quiet, as if you're being tucked gently into a calm, warm bed. Thank you for sharing this moment with Sleepsmyth. Now, relax completely and let the story carry you into a peaceful, restful sleep. Let's begin.
Night descends over kingdoms shaped by ambition, secrecy, and cunning, where marble halls and gilded corridors conceal more than they reveal. Crowns are not simply worn here, they are performed. And the women we meet tonight learn to command not only with authority, but with perception. They discovered that resilience often lies in subtlety, that survival can be crafted in glances, gestures, and carefully measured words, and that the masks they bore, of charm, disguise, or deliberate restraint, became both their greatest strength and the expression of their dual nature. In France, Catherine de' Medici rose from outsider to queen and regent. Navigating a court of shifting alliances and silent threats, she mastered the delicate balance between public virtue and private ambition. Every decision, every interaction, became a tool to protect her crown, assert her influence, and survive in a world that underestimated her. Across the deserts of Egypt, Hatshepsut claimed the king's crown in a world that denied women the throne. She appeared in statues as a man, wore the ceremonial pharaoh's beard, and embraced the duality of identity to command respect. Her mask was both strategy and symbol, allowing her to govern with authority while concealing the true face of her power. In Italy, Lucrezia Borgia moved through the glittering courts of Ferrara. A duchess by marriage, a daughter of the notorious Borgia family, she learned to navigate rumor, rivalry, and expectation. The elegance and composure she projected were carefully honed tools, enabling her to survive, influence, and maintain the duality between the public image and the mind behind it. These are stories of women who wielded power through perception, whose influence was often invisible yet undeniable, whose crowns were secured not only by right, but by the mastery of their masks and the careful balance of duality. Tonight, we open Her Majesty's mask and step behind the facades into the lives of queens who ruled with intelligence, subtlety, and the enduring art of concealment. Queen Catherine de' Medici of France, the widow who wove thrones from threads of smoke. Orphan of Florence. In the city of Florence, where marble palaces cast long shadows across narrow streets, a child was born into a name that carried both glory and danger. Catherine de' Medici entered the world in 1519, daughter of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, and a mother whose family blood ran with ancient French ties. Yet her arrival was wrapped not in celebration, but in sorrow, for her mother died within days of giving her life, and her father soon after, leaving Catherine alone before she could even remember a parent's embrace. She was a Medici, and in Florence, that meant both fortune and peril. The Medici were bankers to kings, patrons of artists, and rulers of the city's fate. But in the restless swirl of Renaissance politics, their power was never secure. And so little Catherine, the orphan in swaddling clothes, became at once a treasure and a pawn. She was passed into the care of relatives, watched over by the hand of Pope Leo X, who was himself a Medici. Her cradle was guarded by wealth and influence, yet also by suspicion, for enemies circled her family like wolves. As a girl, she walked cloisters where whispers echoed louder than prayers. She learned that eyes lingered on her not with affection, but with calculation. Her childhood was not of toys and laughter, but of masks already forming. She smiled when she was expected to smile. She lowered her gaze when men spoke of alliances and dowries. She hid the sharpness of her mind beneath a veil of obedience. Even as a child, she understood what it meant to wear a face that others wished to see, rather than her own. When she was only 11, Florence erupted in rebellion. The Medici were expelled from their seat of power, and Catherine was seized by the mob. The girl who bore the family's name was no longer a child to be pitied, but a symbol to be used. She was placed in a convent, locked behind walls of stone, where nuns became her companions and prayer her only outlet. But Catherine's heart was not broken. She studied, she listened, she waited. Behind the convent's latticed windows, she gazed out at the world with calm patience. Already she understood that survival meant more than strength of body. It meant the strength to endure, to conceal, to adapt. She wore the mask of a quiet, obedient child. Yet within, her mind was shaping itself like tempered steel. When the tides of power turned once more, and the Medici were restored by papal decree, Catherine emerged from the convent not as a frightened girl, but as one who had learned how to wear silence as armor. She had survived riots, imprisonment, and the threat of execution, and yet she carried herself with composure rare for her age. The girl who had lost parents, home, and safety had discovered something more enduring. The art of concealment, of watching, of waiting behind a carefully arranged face. The first mask was already set upon her, and it would never again be removed. A bride for a kingdom. When Catherine left Florence behind, she was not much more than a girl. Yet her destiny was already stitched into the fabric of Europe. The Medici were no longer merely bankers and dukes. They had become entwined with the papacy, and their influence reached far beyond Italy's hills. It was through these threads of alliance and ambition that Catherine was chosen as a bride, not for love, but for the future of kingdoms. She was barely 14 when she was summoned to France. Her marriage was to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I. The match was not dazzling on the surface. Henry was not heir to the throne, and Catherine arrived at court as a foreigner, her Italian manners viewed with suspicion. Yet even here, the pattern of her life revealed itself, underestimated at first glance, but never powerless. The French court was a place of glittering display and hidden rivalries. Great halls sparkled with torches, their stone walls echoing with laughter, music, and whispers. Noble women wore silks bright as jewels. Courtiers moved like dancers in a play, each word carrying double meanings. Into this theater of power stepped Catherine, small in stature, dark-haired, with a gaze both steady and cautious. To some, she seemed plain beside the golden-haired princesses of France. But beneath her modest demeanor, she carried the discipline of survival and the patience of one who had already endured storms. Her wedding was a spectacle designed to impress. Banquets stretched late into the night, tapestries shimmered with stories of conquest, and music floated through the chambers like incense. Yet for Catherine, behind the jewels and fine gowns, it was another mask to wear. She was no longer the orphan of Florence, nor the girl hidden in convent walls. She was now the bride of France, bound to a boy who spoke little to her, whose heart was already devoted to another. Full Henry, the young duke, loved his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly twice his age. Catherine knew it the moment she arrived. She could feel it in the way his eyes followed Diane across the room, in the way his words warmed when he addressed her. It might have broken another girl, to see her new husband's affection belong to another. But Catherine had been forged in silence, and she understood what it meant to play a long game. In the halls of France, Catherine learned quickly. She studied the language, absorbed the customs, and moved with quiet grace through ceremonies and festivals. She became skilled at concealing disappointment behind polite smiles, at listening while others dismissed her as insignificant. And all the while, she observed the currents of power swirling around the French throne. Though she held no influence yet, she understood something vital, that appearances ruled more than truths. A crown glittered not because it was pure gold, but because others believed it so. And so Catherine polished her own mask, the mask of a devoted wife, a courteous duchess, a woman without sharp edges. To some, she seemed invisible. Yet invisibility was its own form of protection. Behind that mask, Catherine waited. She waited as kings hunted and feasted, as courtiers schemed and quarreled, as time shifted like sand. She waited with the patience of one who had survived rebellion and convent walls, knowing that one day her chance would come. For Catherine de' Medici was no ordinary bride. She was a daughter of Florence, born into shadows and secrets, and though she wore the veil of obedience now, she carried within her the quiet certainty that her story was only beginning. Beneath Diane's gaze. Life at the French court was dazzling for some, but for Catherine, it was a long exercise in silence and patience. Her husband Henry, though dutiful in public, gave little warmth in private. His heart, his attention, even his loyalty belonged elsewhere, to Diane de Poitiers. Diane was no ordinary rival. She was graceful, elegant, and wise in the ways of power. 20 years Henry's senior, she had become his guide, his confidant, his beloved. Where Catherine was small and dark-haired, Diane was tall, luminous, adorned with jewels and confidence. In every gathering, it was Diane who held Henry's gaze, Diane who whispered into his ear, Diane whose influence flowed through him like wine through a goblet. For many women, this would have been unbearable, a marriage without affection, a bed shared with a husband who adored another. Yet Catherine endured. She endured with the quiet patience that had already shaped her childhood. She played the role expected of her, the respectful wife, the gracious Duchess, the woman who smiled at Diane with courtesy even as she felt the sting of being overshadowed. She longed for children, for that was her truest duty. Yet for years, no heir came. Whispers spread through the court, cruel as knives in the dark. Some said Catherine was barren, cursed, or unfit to bear the future of France. Some urged Henry to set her aside, to seek a new bride with a stronger womb. Catherine heard every murmur, and behind her composed expression, she carried the weight of dread. But she did not falter. She turned to remedies, to prayers, to the advice of physicians and midwives. She clung to hope even when others mocked. And at last, after nearly a decade of waiting, she bore her first child. The joy of the court was not only in celebration, but in relief, for the line of succession was secure, and Catherine's position was safe, at least for a time. More children followed, 10 in total, though not all would live to adulthood. Yet each birth tightened her place in the royal family. She became the mother of France's future kings, the guardian of a dynasty. But even so, her husband's devotion remained fixed on Diane. Diane advised him on matters of war and politics, sat beside him at councils, and even guided his letters and decrees. Catherine, meanwhile, watched from the edges, outwardly submissive, inwardly observant. She saw how power flowed through subtle channels, not always through crowns or thrones, but through whispers, gestures, and the art of persuasion, so Catherine learned. She studied Diane not as a rival to be destroyed, but as a teacher. She saw how the older woman carried herself, how she cloaked authority in charm, how she shaped Henry's choices without raising her voice. And in this shadow, Catherine honed her own craft of survival. For though Diane ruled Henry's heart, Catherine ruled her own patience. She knew that life, like the shifting tides of Florence, could change in a moment. A tournament, an accident, a twist of fate could alter everything. And when that day came, Catherine would be ready. Until then, she wore her mask. The mask of the overlooked wife, the gentle mother, the quiet Duchess. And behind it, she kept her gaze steady, her thoughts sharp, her resolve unbroken. She was a woman who could wait in silence. And silence, she knew, could one day speak louder than any voice in France. Widow in Black. The summer of 1559 brought with it both splendor and tragedy. France was alive with celebration, for Henry II, now king, had arranged a tournament to honor the marriage of his daughter Elizabeth to the King of Spain. The air was thick with music and laughter, the colors of banners bright against the Parisian sky. Knights in polished armor paraded through the streets, and crowds cheered with voices full of pride. But in the midst of joy, fate sharpened its cruel edge. For Henry, ever eager to prove his valor, took up the lance to joust against a younger challenger. His visor gleamed in the sunlight, his horse stamped impatiently, the crowd roared as hooves thundered across the field. And then, in a single instant, it was undone. The lance of his opponent pierced through Henry's visor, shattering bone and flesh, striking deep into his eye. The festival turned to horror. The king fell, and though physicians tried in vain to save him, his wound festered. For days he lingered in agony, his chamber dark with dread, until at last his breath faded, and France was left without its master. Catherine, now Queen Mother, stood cloaked in black. The woman once overlooked, once overshadowed, was suddenly the most important figure at court. Around her gathered the trembling young King Francis II, barely 15 years of age, and her younger sons who would one day also bear crowns. Catherine's eyes, rimmed with grief, did not waver. She knew that from this moment on, her mask must harden into something impenetrable. For the court was not empty of rivals. Power does not vanish with a king's last breath. It shifts, it scrambles, it hungers. Diane de Poitiers, Henry's lifelong mistress, sought to hold her place near the throne. Noble families sharpened their ambitions, whispering claims into the ears of the new boy king. The mighty houses of Guise, Bourbon, and Montmorency all schemed in the shadows, eager to seize the crown's vulnerability. Catherine understood at once that to protect her children, she must step forward into the storm. She demanded the return of royal jewels that Henry had lavished upon Diane. She distanced the older woman from court with cool finality. Though her heart may have remembered years of humiliation, Catherine did not strike with passion, but with precision. The widow in black now became the silent guardian of her dynasty. In the weeks that followed, she walked the halls like a ghost made of iron. Her gowns dark as midnight, her face pale and unreadable, her presence commanding without a word. Courtiers who had once dismissed her as plain now felt a chill when her gaze met theirs. For Catherine had perfected the art of concealment, grief and strategy braided into one expressionless mask. Her son Francis, fragile and inexperienced, leaned heavily on his mother. Yet his reign was brief, ending with his death only a year later. The crown passed then to her second son, Charles IX, still only a child. And so Catherine stepped firmly into the role that destiny had written for her, regent of France, mother of kings, and mistress of survival. The woman who had once been an orphan, a pawn, a wife in the shadow of another, was now the axis on which France itself would turn. But she knew the crown was never secure. Behind every council chamber, behind every banquet, behind every smile of the nobility, danger lay in wait. And so Catherine wore her widow's black as both mourning and armor. She let it remind the world of her sorrow, but also of her endurance. She became a figure at once tragic and formidable, a queen whose silence carried more weight than the proclamations of men. Widowhood had not diminished her. It had unveiled her. And from that day forward, Catherine de' Medici would never again be underestimated. Mother of Kings. The corridors of the Louvre grew quieter in those years, not with peace, but with the heavy silence of uncertainty. France had lost one king after another. First Francis, taken too soon, and now the crown rested on the head of Charles IX, a boy of 10. His crown glittered brightly, but it was too heavy for his small brow. And so, in truth, it was Catherine who bore its weight. She sat in councils, a widow dressed still in somber black, her face pale, her eyes steady. Around her, men of noble blood bickered like restless dogs, each house eager to seize influence over the young monarch. The powerful Guise family, guardians of Catholic fervor, the Bourbon princes, protectors of Protestant Huguenots, the Montmorency lords, shifting with the winds. Each sought to pull France toward their vision. But Catherine, seated at the center, held her mask firm. She would not be the champion of one faction, nor the pawn of another. She was the mother of kings, and her loyalty was not to party or creed, but to the crown itself. She smiled when needed, frowned when expected, spoke rarely, but listened always. And in her silence, she measured the hearts of those who called themselves France's protectors. Her children became her purpose, but also her battlefield. Charles IX, impressionable and uncertain, clung to her guidance. Henry, her second son, ambitious and sharp, grew restless with each passing year. Francis, her youngest boy, pale and frail, would one day wear the crown as well. And beyond them, her daughters, scattered through Europe by marriages she arranged like pieces upon a board. Catherine's hand stretched far, to Spain, to Poland, to Tuscany. Every match, every alliance was chosen to weave a web that could hold her fragile dynasty together. Yet even as she worked to preserve the crown, France trembled beneath her. The land was divided, torn between Catholic and Protestant, faith and faith, blood and blood. The air itself seemed thick with mistrust. A spark in one city could set half the kingdom aflame. And in this chaos, Catherine sought not victory, but balance. She walked a careful line, offering tolerance to Huguenots one day, reassuring Catholics the next. She held banquets to bring enemies to the same table, arranging feasts where bitter rivals sat side by side, if only for an evening. To some, she appeared indecisive, a queen without conviction. But Catherine knew the truth. She was not indecisive, she was deliberate. For her role was not to fight for one cause, but to keep her sons upon their thrones, no matter what cause threatened to overthrow them. Still, her efforts won her little gratitude. To the Protestants, she was a deceiver who smiled and delayed. To the Catholics, she was too lenient, too willing to compromise with heretics. But Catherine bore the criticism with the same calm mask she had worn since childhood. She knew that rulers were not loved, only remembered. And she cared less for adoration than for endurance. In the gardens of her palaces, she often walked at dusk, her dark figure gliding among marble statues and fountains that whispered with falling water. Courtiers said she consulted astrologers, that she read omens in the stars, that her chambers held mysterious potions and hidden devices. Perhaps it was gossip, perhaps truth. But Catherine did little to quiet such whispers. For mystery itself was a mask, and one she wielded with skill. She was no longer the overlooked wife, nor the grieving widow. She was now the axis upon which France turned, the keeper of crowns, the mother of kings. Her power was not always seen in decrees or battles, but in the fact that her sons remained upon their thrones, when so many forces conspired to unseat them. And as night fell over the kingdom, Catherine de' Medici sat in her chambers, candlelight flickering against her pale face, her eyes reflecting both weariness and resolve. She had worn many masks already, but now she wore the most enduring one. The mask of a queen who ruled through her children, whose strength was veiled in silence, whose power lay not in force, but in the art of survival. Banquets and betrayals. Catherine understood that power was not only fought in battlefields or debated in councils. It was also staged in feasts, in festivals, in the glittering theater of the court. And so she became a mistress of spectacle. Her banquets dazzled the nobility, her entertainments shimmered like dreams, her festivals lingered in memory long after the music faded. Yet beneath every feast, beneath every sparkling goblet and golden platter, there was purpose. The halls of her palaces glowed with torchlight. Long tables groaned beneath the weight of roasted pheasants, candied fruits, sugared almonds piled high in silver bowls. Musicians played lutes and viols, their notes weaving through the hum of conversation, while dancers in masks glided across polished floors. Guests marveled at mechanical devices that made statues move, at illusions that seemed to summon myth and magic into stone chambers. To the nobles of France, Catherine's entertainments were delights of the senses. But they were also traps. For Catherine's banquets were stages where enemies were brought face to face, where alliances were stitched together over shared wine, where betrayals were softened by laughter until the moment came to strike. She seated Protestants beside Catholics, rivals across from rivals, forcing them into civility under her watchful gaze. To refuse her invitation was to insult the crown. To accept was to walk into her theater, where every gesture, every word, every silence was noted. At times, her feasts became shadows of war. Behind the laughter, men measured their rivals' strength, gauged the loyalties of friends, tested the patience of foes. And Catherine, seated at the head of the table, her black gown gleaming with jewels, her face serene and unreadable, watched it all unfold. She spoke softly, raising a glass, offering a smile, and in so doing guided the evening's rhythm like a conductor with an invisible hand. Some whispered that her banquets were poisoned with plots as much as with spices, that a goblet might carry more than wine, that a gesture might signal the fall of a man. These were rumors, carried on restless tongues, but Catherine did not silence them. Instead, she allowed them to grow, for fear itself was a mask she wore with skill. If nobles believed her capable of poison, then they thought twice before crossing her. The world beyond the feasts was trembling with unrest. Rebellions stirred, assassins struck, massacres loomed on the horizon. But within the halls of her palaces, Catherine created a different world, one where order appeared to reign, where her children's crowns gleamed as though untouched by danger. It was illusion, but illusion could be powerful. Full perception itself was a weapon. In these banquets, Catherine revealed her mastery of survival. She could not control the faith of her people, nor the hunger of ambitious lords, nor the tide of civil war that threatened to drown France. But she could control the stage upon which they played. And by doing so, she shaped the story. When the candles burned low and the guests finally departed, the great halls fell into silence again. And Catherine, her mask of hospitality set aside for a moment, would sit in the empty chamber, the perfume of wine and flowers still heavy in the air. She knew that joy had been a costume, laughter a disguise, music a veil. But disguises were what kept the crown secure. For Catherine de' Medici, every banquet was both a celebration and a chessboard, and every betrayal was simply another move in the endless game she had been playing since childhood. Whispers of Blood. Paris, in the summer of 1572, shimmered with expectation. The city was alive with banners, bells, and the sound of horses clattering over cobblestones. For a wedding had been arranged, one meant to heal France's deepest wound. Catherine had orchestrated the marriage of her daughter, Marguerite, to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince. It was a union meant to bridge the chasm between Catholic and Huguenot, to bind the kingdom together with vows of love and peace. The streets filled with nobles from across France, Catholics and Protestants gathering beneath the same sky. The wedding feast was splendid, the wine abundant, the laughter rising high above the Seine. To many, it seemed that the long years of civil war might finally yield to harmony. But beneath the music and toasts, unease lingered. For not everyone welcomed peace, and not every guest trusted the hand that offered it. Catherine moved through the festivities with her usual calm. Her dark eyes rested on every face, her smile polite, her presence composed. Yet in the silence of her chambers, the truth pressed heavily against her heart. The factions of France were not softened by feasts. They were sharpened by them. The Catholic Guy's family, burning with vengeance, whispered that Protestants plotted treachery. Huguenots muttered that they were being lured into a trap. And Catherine herself, caught between her children's crowns and the fury of the nation, wade paths that all seemed edged with blood. Then came the attempt on Admiral Coligny, the Protestant leader, struck by an assassin's bullet but not slain. Tension broke into open fear. Protestant nobles demanded justice. Catholic lords whispered of conspiracies. The streets of Paris grew restless, soldiers gathered, the air thickened with dread. And in that moment, Catherine's mask hardened into something unyielding. On the night of St. Bartholomew's Day, the bells of Paris tolled. Doors burst open, swords flashed, torches flared. The city descended into chaos as Catholics turned upon their Protestant neighbors. Blood stained the cobblestones, cries echoed against stone walls, the Seine itself carried the bodies of the slain. It was a night of terror, a storm of murder that swept through Paris and spread to towns across France. History has debated Catherine's hand in that massacre. Some claim she planned it, that her smile at the wedding feast had always concealed a dagger. Others say she was swept along by forces greater than herself, powerless to stop the tide once it began. But whatever the truth, her name became forever bound to the horror. Catherine, the mother of kings, was seen by many as the mother of blood. Yet even then, she wore her mask. In the days that followed, she appeared calm, commanding, collected. She spoke of order restored, of loyalty to the crown, of unity preserved through decisive action. But behind her pale face, what lay, triumph or despair? Was she the architect of slaughter, or its prisoner? The world would never know. For Catherine understood that sometimes the mask became the only face one could wear. She had long since learned that perception ruled more powerfully than truth. And so she did not protest when whispers accused her. She did not plead innocence, nor confess guilt. She simply endured, as she always had, letting her silence deepen the mystery around her name. The bells of Paris grew quiet. The blood dried on the stones. But the memory lingered, and Catherine de' Medici's shadow grew darker than ever. She was no longer merely the mother of kings, nor the widow in black, nor the mistress of banquets. She had become, in the eyes of many, the queen whose mask concealed a heart as impenetrable as the night itself. The Queen of Shadows. The years weighed heavily upon Catherine, yet she carried them with the same composure she had worn since girlhood. She had survived rebellions and riots, exile and imprisonment, the disdain of her husband, the scorn of rivals, the fury of civil war. She had placed crowns upon the heads of 3 sons, Francis, Charles, and Henry, and through them had ruled a kingdom more divided than ever before. And still she endured. Her figure, once lithe and overlooked, grew stooped and weary. Her face, once pale and plain, became lined with the years of watching, waiting, calculating. Yet her presence never faded. Even in her old age, dressed in somber black, her eyes still held the same steady calm that had silenced courts and unsettled enemies. Nobles bent before her, generals sought her counsel, ambassadors treated her as the heart of France. For though kings reigned, it was Catherine who had woven the fabric of their rule. She walked the gardens of her palaces more slowly now, leaning upon attendants, her steps measured, her breath heavier. Yet as she gazed at the fountains and marble statues, perhaps she thought of Florence, of the convent walls where her childhood had been confined. Perhaps she remembered the banquet halls of France, where she had smiled as rivals plotted across her table. Perhaps she thought of Diane, long gone, and the shadowed years when Catherine herself had been invisible. The kingdom she had fought so fiercely to preserve remained restless. Catholics and Protestants still glared at one another across battlefields. France's fields bore scars of fire and blood. Her sons, though crowned, had never grown strong enough to heal the land. And yet, without Catherine's hand, the monarchy itself might not have survived at all. Whispers clung to her to the very end, that she poisoned her enemies with subtle draughts, that she dabbled in astrology, summoning secrets from the stars, that she ruled with cruelty behind her mask of piety. Some said she was a witch, others that she was a savior. She never confirmed, she never denied. She let the shadows gather around her name until the shadows themselves became part of her power. In January of 1589, Catherine de' Medici closed her eyes for the last time. She was nearly 70 years old, and with her passing, an era came to its quiet end. She was laid to rest not as the overlooked orphan of Florence, nor as the wife overshadowed by a mistress, but as the queen mother who had guided France through decades of turmoil. Her legacy was tangled, like smoke rising in a cold wind. To some, she was the Black Widow, the queen of poison, the architect of massacre. To others, she was the mother who held a fragile dynasty together with sheer endurance. Perhaps she was both, or perhaps she was something that lay hidden between truth and legend, never to be fully seen. What is certain is this: Catherine de' Medici lived and ruled behind a mask of silence, of composure, of unbroken patience. And when the mask at last was lowered, nothing remained but mystery. She had not merely worn the mask, she had become it. And so, long after her voice was silenced, Catherine's shadow lingers in the holes of history. A queen not remembered for her beauty, nor for her triumphs upon battlefields, but for her mastery of concealment. For behind her crown, behind her widow's veil, behind every banquet and every whisper, there was always a face the world thought it saw, and another that it never could. Pharaoh Hatshepsut of Egypt, the queen who wore a king's crown. Princess of the Nile. The Nile flowed as it had for thousands of years, carrying silt and song, feeding the fields and the souls of Egypt. It was upon its sacred banks, in the city of Thebes, that a princess was born into the royal house of the 18th dynasty. Her name was Hatshepsut, foremost of noble women. Even as an infant, wrapped in linen and placed beneath painted ceilings of stars, she was surrounded by the weight of ancient tradition. Her father, Pharaoh Thutmose I, was a warrior king whose conquests stretched Egypt's borders further than before. He placed her on his knee, showed her the golden crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, and whispered that she was a child of divine blood. Yet the court around her saw only a daughter, not an heir. The throne was meant for sons, warriors, and kings who carried the falcon god Horus upon their brow. And so, from the moment of her birth, Hatshepsut lived within a paradox. She was royal, but she was limited, beloved, but underestimated. Her childhood unfolded among colonnades and courtyards, where incense curled through the air and priests recited prayers to Ammonius, the hidden god. She learned the rites of temple offerings, the stories of gods and goddesses, and the measured beauty of hieroglyphs carved into limestone. Unlike many daughters of Egypt, she was taught not only to weave garlands and sing hymns, but to read the sacred scripts, to listen in the halls where men spoke of law and command. Even then, she seemed to watch more closely than others, as if she knew that power was a mask woven from words as much as from weapons. Her mother, Queen Almos, wrapped her in silks and pressed into her heart the lessons of grace and patience. Yet beyond the gardens, she saw the rituals of succession unfold. Princes groomed to lead, generals honored for their victories, scribes praised for their counsel. Where did a daughter fit into this procession of power? Hatshepsut walked with calm through these questions, her face already schooled into serenity, her eyes holding secrets that even as a child no one could quite name. When Pharaoh Thutmose I looked upon his daughter, he did not see only her sex. In her poise and confidence, he glimpsed something enduring. Some whispered that he loved her above his other children, that he saw in her the spirit of kingship, even if the law and custom would never allow it. And so he granted her the rare title of God's wife of Ammonius, an honor of both piety and influence. It was a title that made her a bridge between mortal and divine, between priesthood and throne. Already, the mask was forming. The Nile shifted with the seasons, swelling and receding, and so too did the fortunes of the court. Brothers, half-brothers, cousins, all possible heirs, moved about her like shadows in a great play. She was a princess among princes, a noblewoman among warriors, yet she learned to glide unseen between their ambitions. Always watching, always listening, like the hidden god Ammonius whom her people worshipped. As the years unfolded, Hatshepsut grew into a young woman of striking presence, not famed for beauty, but for the calm steadiness of her gaze. She carried herself not with the softness expected of maidens, but with the bearing of someone already cloaked in destiny. The courtiers looked at her and saw a dutiful daughter, a priestess, a bride-to-be. But beneath that surface another self was waiting, a self that would one day step into the light of eternity, clad not as queen but as pharaoh. For now, though, she remained the princess of the Nile, a girl among the lotus blossoms, drifting between innocence and ambition. The river carried its secrets forward as it always did, and with it, the story of a child who would one day wear a mask so complete, so powerful, that even stone itself would bow to her illusion. The bride of the gods' chosen king. As Hatshepsut blossomed into womanhood, her path was drawn by the currents of dynasty. She, the daughter of Thutmose I, was not free to choose her destiny. Egypt's throne, like the Nile itself, flowed through ancient channels of inheritance, unyielding and sacred. And so, to secure the line, she was wed to her half-brother, Thutmose II. The marriage was not born of love, but of necessity. Thutmose II was the son of a lesser wife, a boy of frilier health, and his claim to the throne required Hatshepsut's nobler blood. By joining her to him, the royal line was reinforced, and his rule strengthened. In the silent halls of Karnak, beneath walls carved with falcons and lotus blooms, the young princess was crowned queen. She stepped into her role with calm grace, as though she had long been rehearsing for it in secret. As queen consort, Hatshepsut carried titles that shimmered with ancient weight: Great Wife of the King, God's Wife of Ammonius. She stood at the king's side during rituals, offered incense to the gods, and appeared in public processions robed in linen, adorned with lapis and gold. To the eyes of Egypt, she was a dutiful wife, fulfilling the roles expected of a royal woman. But beneath the silken veil, her mind wandered deeper. She watched her husband, sickly, uncertain, dependent on advisors, and she measured the frailty of his kingship against the vast endurance of the throne itself. The court whispered. Some said it was Hatshepsut's strength that kept the palace steady. Others muttered that the young queen was ambitious, her gaze lingering too long upon the double crown of Egypt. Yet in public, she wore serenity like a flawless mask. Her gestures were gentle, her words obedient, her smile soft as the moonlight over the Nile. Behind that mask, however, she was gathering knowledge, of rituals, of decrees, of the language of power spoken in the shadows of columns. Her husband's reign was brief, a flicker against the eternal sun of Ra. He struggled to assert himself, relying heavily on generals and priests, while Hatshepsut observed, silent but keen. She noted how courtiers bowed, how emissaries from foreign lands sought favor, how wealth moved with the currents of trade from Nubia, Punt, and beyond. The boy king wore the crowns, but the princess of the Nile was learning how to wield them. When the time came that Thutmose II's health faltered beyond return, the palace grew heavy with uncertainty. He left behind a young son by a lesser wife, Thutmose III, still a child too small to wear the crowns. And so the throne trembled between tradition and necessity. Egypt could not be left without guidance, not while enemies pressed at its borders and rivals watched hungrily. It was then that Hatshepsut stepped forward, her face calm, her voice steady, cloaked in the language of piety and guardianship. She declared herself regent, the protector of the boy king, the widow who would guide Egypt until her stepson grew to manhood. To the priests, she spoke of duty. To the generals, she spoke of stability. To the people, she spoke of the God's will. And they believed her, for who would suspect that behind her widow's veil, another design was slowly taking shape? In those years as royal bride, Hatshepsut had learned the art of silence, of masking ambition with devotion. She had worn the smile of a queen, but within her eyes lingered the vision of something greater. The Nile flowed on, carrying its secrets beneath its surface. And so too did Hatshepsut, veiling her power behind the gentle face of a bride, waiting for the moment when illusion would become reality. One hidden crown. The palace of Thebes fell into mourning after the death of Thutmose II. The air seemed heavy with incense and grief, yet beneath the laments, a sharper fear ran through the court. For the king's son and heir, Thutmose III, was but a boy, too young to bear the weight of Egypt's crowns, too small to command armies or lead rituals before the gods. The throne stood vulnerable, and the empire's enemies watched like jackals at the edge of firelight. It was then that Hatshepsut stepped forward, veiled in the dignity of widowhood, her face composed, her voice steady. She spoke not of ambition, but of guardianship. She would act only as regent, she said, guiding Egypt until the child was old enough to reign in his own right. The priests of Ammonius bowed to her words, the generals accepted her counsel, and the courtiers, though wary, could not deny the strength of her presence. For a time, she played the part flawlessly. In reliefs and inscriptions, she appeared as the dutiful stepmother, standing protectively beside the boy king. She presided over ceremonies, ensured the offerings flowed to the temples, and kept the court in order. To the people, she was a widow acting in piety, a mother figure serving the will of the gods. But behind the polished mask of regency, Hatshepsut was weaving something larger. Each year, her authority grew. She issued decrees in her own name, directed the treasury, and advised on military campaigns. The child king remained in the background, his presence symbolic, while hers became essential. Slowly, the courtiers who once doubted her began to rely upon her. And slowly, the line between regent and ruler blurred. She understood the delicate dance she performed. To move too quickly would rouse suspicion, to overreach would summon rebellion. So she cloaked her steps in patience, veiling ambition with devotion, hiding intent beneath ritual. When she ordered temples to be built or festivals to be held, she spoke of honoring the gods, not herself. When she commanded expeditions or appointed officials, she spoke of securing the boy's inheritance. Yet each act bound Egypt more tightly to her hand. Whispers began to ripple through the palace. Some said the widow had no intention of yielding the throne. Some said she was guided by the god Ammonius himself, who whispered to her in dreams. Others muttered that Egypt had never seen such a woman, calm, unshaken, moving like the Nile in flood, silent yet unstoppable. But still she wore her mask of humility. Still she played the role of regent, even as she gathered the regalia of kingship piece by piece. In the shadows of Karnak, she turned more often to the priests of Ammonius, those who could sanctify her authority. She reminded them of her rare title, God's wife of Ammonius, and spoke of her divine bloodline as daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I. She let them believe, or perhaps she convinced them, that it was not ambition that moved her, but the gods themselves. A mask within a mask, woven from faith and fear. The boy Thutmose grew, but still the kingdom looked to Hatshepsut. The regent's presence was steady as stone, her composure unbroken. And in the hushed corridors of the palace, it became clear, Hatshepsut was no longer merely the guardian of a throne. She was becoming the throne itself. The Nile swelled and receded, seasons turning, years flowing past like water in the riverbed. And all the while, Egypt saw not a woman seizing power, but a widow protecting it. That was the brilliance of her mask, the illusion so carefully crafted that it became truth in the eyes of her people. And through that illusion, Hatshepsut prepared to step into a role no daughter of the Nile had ever dared claim before. Pharaoh in all but name. Seasons passed, and the boy King Thutmose III grew taller, his limbs lengthening, his voice shifting toward manhood. Yet in the courts of Thebes, it was not his name that carried authority, but that of Hatshepsut. She had ruled as regent with such steadiness that the kingdom scarcely noticed the difference between mother's hand and monarch's hand. And in that quiet, subtle way, she prepared Egypt for a truth that no one dared to speak aloud. It began with imagery. Reliefs once carved with Hatshepsut standing behind her stepson now showed her in equal size, equal stance. Soon, she was depicted leading rituals alone, offering gifts to the gods with her own name inscribed in the stone. The scribes, guided by her command, began to list her titles with greater grandeur, daughter of Amun. Chosen by the sun god Ra, she who brings peace to the two lands. Each phrase edged her closer to the aura of kingship. Then came the regalia. At first, she wore the headdresses of queens, tall, elegant, adorned with the vulture goddess of protection. But gradually, the symbols of Pharaoh appeared upon her brow. The uraeus, the rearing cobra of divine authority. The striped Neem's headdress of kings. The crook and flail, crossed upon her chest. Even the false beard, bound beneath her chin, transforming her image from woman to king. It was a disguise, yes, but more than disguise. It was theater, ritual, sacred performance. Egypt had never known a ruling queen, but it had always known Pharaoh. And so Hatshepsut gave them Pharaoh. She wrapped herself in the mask of kingship so completely that the people saw not contradiction, but continuity. They did not see a woman in borrowed robes. They saw the living embodiment of Horus upon earth. When she finally declared herself Pharaoh, the court bowed, not with sudden shock, but with weary acceptance. For had she not already ruled for years? Had she not preserved the temples, guided the armies, expanded trade, and kept famine from the land? The boy king was still too young, and Egypt needed strength. Hatshepsut's illusion had become reality, her mask indistinguishable from truth. Still, whispers coiled like serpents in the shadows. Some muttered that it was blasphemy, that the throne was not meant for a woman. Others feared her cunning, her ability to weave power with patience and silence. But none could deny that under her hand, Egypt was steady. The Nile swelled, harvests flourished, trade ships returned laden with gold, ivory, and incense. If this was illusion, then it was one the gods themselves seemed to bless. At Karnak, she commissioned towering obelisks of red granite, their tips gilded with electrum to catch the rays of the rising sun. Upon their faces were carved the words that she was chosen, beloved, eternal. Their height pierced the sky, their light dazzled the people, and their permanence declared what the courtiers whispered but could not deny: Hatshepsut was Pharaoh. In those years, she was no longer the dutiful widow nor the gentle regent. She was the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, the son of Ra. She signed decrees with the cartouche of Pharaoh, sat upon the throne in ceremonies, and led processions not as consort but as sovereign. The child Thutmose stood beside her, still named co-ruler in formalities, but the kingdom saw clearly where the true power lay. And yet, even in her triumph, she remained veiled by her own creation. To preserve her reign, she could never simply be herself. She was not Hatshepsut the woman. She was Pharaoh Hatshepsut, cloaked in the mask of eternity, her identity carved into stone as king, not queen. The illusion had become her life. The mask had become her face. And Egypt, dazzled by its brilliance, bowed as if it had always been so. Her golden reign. With the double crown upon her head and the crook and flail resting across her chest, Hatshepsut reigned not as a caretaker, but as Pharaoh. And under her rule, Egypt entered an age of peace, wealth, and wonder that rivaled the glories of the ancestors. The mask she wore had not been torn away by doubt nor rebellion. Instead, it gleamed brighter than gold, convincing even her skeptics that perhaps this woman was touched by the divine. Her reign was marked not by endless wars, but by vision. She understood that strength was not only measured in battlefields, but in trade routes, temples, and prosperity that touched every home along the Nile. She restored old sanctuaries, repaired what time and invasion had broken, and filled the air with festivals that bound the people closer to their gods. At Karnak, her obelisks rose like fingers of flame, catching the dawn light, proclaiming in stone what words alone could not. But perhaps her boldest dream was the journey to the land of Punt. Far beyond the Red Sea, across waves few Egyptians dared to sail, lay a land rich in incense, ebony, and gold. Hatshepsut commanded a fleet of ships to brave the waters, their sails catching desert winds, their decks laden with offerings to foreign gods. Months later, the fleet returned, their holds bursting with treasures unseen in Egypt for generations. Myrrh trees, incense, exotic animals, ivory tusks, a bounty that dazzled the people and proclaimed Pharaoh's power without a single sword being drawn. Reliefs carved upon her temple at Deir el-Bahari immortalized the voyage. Rows of ships with swelling sails, Puntite chiefs bowing in tribute, strange animals led upon ropes. The story was etched in stone not only as record, but as performance. For Hatshepsut understood that power endured not only in deeds, but in the way those deeds were remembered. Her temples and monuments were her stage, and Egypt was her audience. Under her hand, peace settled across the two lands. Farmers tilled rich soil as the Nile delivered its floods. Merchants filled markets with luxuries from far coasts. Priests sang hymns in sanctuaries newly gilded. Even the people, who once may have questioned the sight of a woman upon the throne, began to accept her as Pharaoh. For what mattered more, the form of a ruler or the blessings they brought? Yet still, the mask was never set aside. On every wall, every carving, Hatshepsut was shown not as woman, but as king. Muscled arms, broad chest, false beard beneath her chin. In words and images alike, she had woven her identity into the eternal role of Pharaoh. To remind the people she was simply Hatshepsut, the woman would have been to unweave her power. And so she became her mask more fully with each passing year, until perhaps even she believed it. Her palace shimmered with the fragrance of incense from Punt, her temples filled with priests praising her as divine daughter of Amun. The courtiers who had once doubted her bowed without hesitation. Even the young Thutmose III, her stepson and co-ruler, stood quietly in her shadow, watching as Egypt flourished beneath her hand. It was a golden reign, bright and untroubled on its surface, yet behind the brilliance, Hatshepsut knew how fragile illusions could be. For masks, however carefully carved, were always vulnerable to time. Thrown on shifting sands. The sun still rose each morning over the gleaming obelisks of Karnak, and the Nile still swelled with its eternal rhythm. Yet in the quiet halls of the palace, where courtiers whispered and guards stood too still, shadows began to stretch across the brightness of Hatshepsut's reign. For the boy who had once stood at her side, the young co-ruler Thutmose III, was no longer a child. He had grown into a man, his frame hardened by military training, his spirit restless with ambition. And all the while, the throne that was his by right had remained cloaked in the hands of his stepmother. He had watched her carefully through the years, watched her temples rise like mountains, her images carved as king, her name spoken with reverence across the two lands. Watched as she became not only regent, but pharaoh in full. To the people, he was still a shadow beside her. To the generals, he was a prince with potential but no crown. And though outwardly he bowed to her, within his heart grew a storm of pride and resentment. Hatshepsut, with her steady calm, surely sensed it. She was too keen, too practiced in the art of perception not to notice the flicker in his eyes, the sharpness in his tone. Yet she did not falter. She maintained her mask of composure, her illusion of eternal rule. For she had reigned too long, achieved too much, to step aside now. Egypt was hers to guide, and she believed perhaps the gods themselves had chosen her to hold it. The court grew uneasy. Some whispered that Thutmose should be given command of armies, a chance to claim his place in glory. Others feared what would happen if the young man, now grown and strong, sought to strip power from the queen who had ruled so long. The palace was a house of mirrors, smiles at the banquet table, daggers of thought hidden beneath the robes. And yet, in public, Hatshepsut never let her serenity waver. She continued to build, to commission, to appear in processions as Pharaoh, the son of Ra, the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. Her obelisks pierced the sky, her temples proclaimed her eternity, her voice echoed in decrees sealed with the cartouche of kings. To the world, she was unchallenged. To herself, perhaps, she was untouchable, but shadows do not vanish beneath sunlight. They cling at the edges, waiting for the light to falter. And in those years, as Thutmose III grew into his strength, the shadow lengthened, attention hung unspoken in the air, like a storm waiting beyond the horizon. Perhaps Hatshepsut believed her mask would protect her forever. Perhaps she trusted that her monuments, her obelisks, her temples would outlast any rival. But the truth was that no mask, however perfect, could shield against the passage of time or the will of those who waited in silence. Egypt basked still in her golden reign. Yet already, the first cracks had begun to show. And though the courtiers continued to bow, though the priests continued to sing, a question lingered like a whisper in the dark. How long could even the most brilliant mask endure? Disappearance of a queen. For more than 2 decades, Hatshepsut had worn the crown of Pharaoh, guiding Egypt through peace, prosperity, and splendor. Yet history remembers her reign not only for its brilliance, but for its mystery. For one day, the queen who had dared to reign as king simply vanished from the record, as if swallowed by the sands of her own desert kingdom. The end of her life remains clouded in silence. There are no grand inscriptions marking her passing, no solemn declarations carved into temple walls. Unlike the kings before her, whose deaths were proclaimed with ritual and mourning, Hatshepsut seemed to fade quietly, her departure unmarked by fanfare. Some say she died peacefully in her palace chambers, her body laid to rest with the rites of a pharaoh. Others whisper of intrigue, of poison slipped into wine, of betrayal by those closest to her. Still others wonder if illness claimed her, a queen undone not by enemies, but by the frailty of mortal flesh. What is certain is what followed. With her gone, Thutmose III stepped fully into the light of kingship. At last, the throne was his, unshared, undisputed. And though he had waited long in her shadow, he would not be content to let that shadow linger. Slowly, deliberately, he began to erase her. Her images were chiseled from temple walls. Her name was struck from inscriptions. Statues of her as pharaoh were smashed, broken into fragments, cast into pits as though the stone itself could be silenced. Reliefs that once showed her with the false beard of kings were scraped clean, replaced with the figures of other rulers. It was as if Thutmose sought to unwind the illusion she had woven, to make it appear that she had never reigned at all. And yet, for all the chisels and hammers, her presence could not be fully erased. Her monuments stood too tall, her obelisks too firmly rooted in the earth. At Karnak, one of her soaring granite obelisks remained, hidden partially by walls built around it, as if her successor had tried to bury her brilliance rather than destroy it. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari, carved into the cliffs, still bore her mark, whispering her story to those who would listen centuries later. Thus, Hatshepsut disappeared not only in body, but in memory. The woman who had dared to wear the mask of Pharaoh was concealed behind the silence of history itself. Generations would pass with her name forgotten, her reign erased from lists of kings. The sands would cover her story, leaving behind only fragments and whispers. Yet silence itself can become a mask, and within that silence, her legacy waited, waiting for time, for discovery, for the patience of those who would one day uncover the truth. Though her enemies tried to blot her out, her reign was too extraordinary to vanish forever. Like a hidden painting beneath layers of plaster, her image endured, ready to emerge when the world was willing to see her again. So ended the reign of Hatshepsut, not in triumph, nor in spectacle, but in quiet disappearance, veiled in mystery. A queen who had ruled as king, whose mask had protected her for decades, now vanished behind another mask, that of absence, of deliberate forgetting. The eternal mask. The desert keeps its secrets well. For centuries, the story of Hatshepsut lay buried beneath shifting sands and broken stones. Her name, once spoken with reverence in temple hymns, had been struck from king lists. Her statues lay shattered, her images erased, her memory veiled in silence. To the world, it was as though she had never ruled at all. And yet, silence is never truly empty. Beneath the dust, fragments of her reign endured, waiting. The soaring obelisks she raised at Karnak still caught the morning sun. The terraces of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri still stretched like arms from the cliffs, their columns whispering of a woman who had dared to shape eternity. Even broken statues, cast into pits, carried her likeness in fragments of stone, her power refusing to vanish completely. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell, and still her story lingered unseen. Until in time, the scholars and explorers of later ages brushed away the sand and uncovered her face once more. Bit by bit, her reign emerged from the silence. Inscriptions deciphered, monuments studied, tombs opened. Slowly, the forgotten pharaoh returned to history. And with her return came the mask once again. For even in rediscovery, Hatshepsut remained a figure of duality. To some, she was the bold queen who claimed the throne in a man's world, cloaking herself in the regalia of kings to ensure her power. To others, she was the usurper who overshadowed her stepson, her reign a defiance of tradition that demanded erasure. Scholars debated her motives, her methods, her very image. Was she ambitious or pious, cunning or dutiful, visionary or vain? Perhaps she was all of these, and perhaps none fully. What is certain is this: she mastered the art of perception. Her statues, her obelisks, her temples were not mere structures, but masks of eternity. They told the people how to see her, how to remember her, how to accept her rule. And when those masks were struck down, another mask, the mask of silence, concealed her for centuries more. Yet even silence cannot endure forever. In the end, her story rose again, not as queen, not as usurper, but as pharaoh, one of the most successful to ever reign in the land of the Nile. She had worn the mask until it became her, and in doing so, she ensured that her name, once buried, would one day rise like the sun, too radiant to be hidden. Hatshepsut, the queen who became a king, the daughter who became the son of Ra, the woman who wore the mask so completely that history itself could not decide who she truly was. Her reign remains not only in monuments of stone, but in the mystery she left behind. And perhaps that is the greatest mask of all, the mask of legend, the mask that allows us to dream of who she might have been beneath it. A queen, a pharaoh, a woman cloaked in eternity. Duchess Lucrezia Borgia of Ferrara, the woman behind the Borgia name. Daughter of papal intrigue. Lucrezia Borgia entered the world in 1570, in the heart of Rome, where the city's stone streets and gilded palaces whispered with power, ambition, and unspoken danger. From her earliest days, She was surrounded by the currents of influence that would shape her life more than any lullaby or cradle could. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, was a man of immense intellect and relentless ambition, who would one day become Pope Alexander VI. Her mother, Venozia Catanii, offered warmth and devotion, yet even her tender care could not shield Lucrezia from the weight of the Borgia name. In those first years, Lucrezia learned quickly that appearances were fragile, that smiles could conceal calculation, and that loyalty could turn as swiftly as the Tiber's waters after a storm. Courtiers moved like shadows through her father's palaces, each gesture measured, each word chosen with care. Young Lucrezia absorbed these movements, the glances and half-smiles, storing them like precious secrets. Even at play, her world was a courtly dance. Dolls became miniature lords and ladies, games of chase became lessons in observation, and stories of saints and sinners intertwined seamlessly with politics. The child who would become Duchess was acutely aware of the gaze of others, the weight of rumor, the delicate balance of respect and fear. She noticed how servants and advisers bent beneath her father's will, how the courtiers' eyes flickered with ambition or caution, and how the world seemed to move according to invisible lines only some could read. She began to understand the paradox that would define her entire life, that survival, influence, and even love could hinge on the careful arrangement of perception, the art of presenting oneself as the world expected while safeguarding what lay beneath. Her education was unlike that of most children. Tutors arrived with lessons in Latin, music, poetry, and history, but also in observation, diplomacy, and the quiet navigation of power. Lucrezia learned to read not only words but intentions, expressions, and silences. Each lesson became a tool, another thread in the intricate veil she would later wear as her mask. Life in Rome moved with both splendor and peril. Processions through sunlit piazzas, candles flickering in palaces, the distant tolling of church bells, all were backdrops to a young girl's education in diplomacy and discretion. Even at a tender age, Lucrezia was aware of the tension between public performance and private understanding, between the face presented to the world and the mind that watched, calculated, and adapted. By the time she reached her early teens, the foundations of her extraordinary life were set. She had learned that her family name was both a shield and a weapon, that beauty and charm could protect or endanger, and that knowledge, quietly gathered and carefully applied, was a form of power in itself. Within the walls of Rome, surrounded by the swirl of intrigue and ambition, the daughter of Rodrigo Borgia began to understand the art of concealment, the power of subtlety, and the necessity of the mask she would one day wear with unmatched grace. A marriage of power. By the time Lucrezia was 12, Rome had already taught her that appearances could shape destiny as surely as any decree, and that silence often carried more weight than speech. The swirling currents of the Borgia household now swept her toward her first political marriage, a union less of hearts than of strategy, a delicate placement in the intricate web of alliances her family spun. She was to wed Giovanni Sforza, a man whose family name carried prestige but whose personality lacked the cunning of her father. And so, the girl who had learned to observe now stepped into the theater of performance, donning the first of many masks. The days before the wedding were a masterclass in subtlety. Lucrezia watched her surroundings with the eyes of a student, noting which gestures earned respect, which smiles concealed ambition, and which silences commanded attention. Even the grandeur of the ceremony, the glittering halls, the rustle of silks and jewels, was a lesson in the power of spectacle. Every step, every bow, every measured laugh became part of the persona she would project to the world. Traveling to Ferrara for the marriage, she glimpsed the first taste of life beyond Rome's walls. Palaces rose like islands of stone, gardens spilled with color and fragrance, and the courtiers' eyes followed her with curiosity and judgment. She learned quickly that each glance was a test, each conversation a subtle negotiation. Her charm, her youth, and her quiet intelligence became instruments, shaping how others perceived her. Even amidst celebration, danger whispered. Rumors of poisonings, family rivalries, and political betrayal danced like sparks at the edges of candlelight. Lucrezia's innocence became both shield and tool. She learned that listening could be as powerful as speaking, that a gentle smile could disarm suspicion, and that every gesture could communicate strength without drawing overt attention. As days turned into months, Lucrezia began to understand the paradox of her existence, that she must be seen, admired, and obedient, yet at the same time she must gather knowledge, cultivate alliances, and subtly assert influence. In every conversation, she practiced the balance of charm and discretion, learning the unspoken rules that would govern her life as a duchess. By the time she fully settled into Ferrara, Lucrezia had begun to step beyond mere observation. She was learning to move subtly within the currents of power, to guide decisions behind the scenes, to transform perception into influence. The young girl who had arrived as a bride in a ceremonial gown was becoming a duchess capable of maneuvering with quiet precision, shaping her world while wearing the mask that the world expected. And so, in the glittering halls of Ferrara, surrounded by courtiers, music, and the ever-present hum of political intrigue, Lucrezia Borgia learned the first lessons of survival, performance, and influence that would carry her through the complexities of a life forever observed, judged, and whispered about. The Ferrara Labyrinth. The court of Ferrara was a world unlike any Lucrezia had known before. Marble halls stretched beneath vaulted ceilings, frescoes glimmered with gold and pigment, and gardens spilled with the scent of jasmine and citrus, their paths winding like the alliances she would have to master. The air was thick with perfume, politics, and the quiet calculations of those who measured every glance and gesture. Each day, Lucrezia moved through the labyrinth of courtiers, advisors, and distant nobles, learning that every smile and bow was a negotiation, and every word a subtle test of wit and perception. Ferrara itself seemed to pulse with life, a city poised between tradition and ambition. From her balcony, Lucrezia could see the river winding past the stone bridges, merchants calling their wares, and the towers of the city catching the afternoon sun. But the beauty of the city was mirrored by the intricacies of the court, where every invitation to dine, every dance at a masquerade, carried the weight of strategy and influence. She realized quickly that power in Ferrara was not given but woven, a tapestry of alliances, favors, and silences. The young Duchess became a careful observer. She noticed which courtiers lingered in conversation to gauge reactions, which advisors whispered warnings behind closed doors, and which nobles measured her with eyes both admiring and calculating. She learned to listen more than she spoke, to respond with measured grace, and to let her charm shield her while her mind mapped the currents of intrigue around her. Even in seemingly idle moments, the court was a web of subtle pressures, each thread connected to loyalty, ambition, or rivalry. Lucrezia's days were a dance of appearances and quiet influence. At banquets, she would sit with a composed smile, allowing herself to observe, while small gestures, a nod, a tilt of the head, the choice of words, signaled understanding and alliance. Every invitation, every gift, every compliment became part of the silent language of power she was learning to speak fluently. The Ferrara labyrinth was as much about observation as action, and she moved through it with a growing elegance. Yet the labyrinth was not without danger. Rumors, jealousies, and rivalries curled through the corridors like smoke, invisible yet suffocating. Lucrezia understood that misstep or impatience could be costly, and that knowledge was the most potent weapon she could wield. She began to cultivate allies, protect her position, and subtly guide outcomes, all while maintaining the appearance of innocence and grace. By the time the seasons changed, Lucrezia Borgia was no longer merely the young bride who had arrived in ceremonial splendor. She was a duchess learning the rhythm of power, the cadence of diplomacy, and the art of subtle influence. The Ferrara labyrinth had tested her observation, her patience, and her intellect, and she had begun to emerge as a presence both admired and measured, a young woman whose influence was quiet but undeniable, hidden behind the veneer of charm and duty. Silver tongues and obscured eyes. In the glittering halls of Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia soon discovered that words were more dangerous than swords. Every compliment could conceal rivalry, every laugh might hide judgment, and every bow was measured not only in respect but in potential manipulation. Courtiers spoke with silver tongues, their phrases polished and seductive, yet their eyes betrayed the truths they dared not speak aloud. Lucrezia learned to read both, to discern intention from performance, and to weigh each gesture with careful precision. The young Duchess became a student of human behavior. She observed which alliances formed in whispered corridors, which rivalries festered behind silken curtains, and which reputations shifted with the slightest rumor. Every conversation, however casual it seemed, was a miniature battle of perception. She realized that in Ferrara, as in her father's household, the world was rarely as it appeared, and that power often lay not in what one commanded openly, but in what one suggested, concealed, or allowed others to believe. Even beyond the palace, Ferrara itself seemed to participate in the subtle games of influence. Nobles' carriages rattled across cobblestone streets, merchants exchanged news laced with speculation, and the city's fountains murmured like a chorus of unseen observers. Lucrezia absorbed it all, understanding that information, carefully gathered and quietly wielded, could protect her, empower her, and guide the moves of those around her. At court, her growing grace and charm became tools, not merely ornaments. A tilt of the head, a soft laugh, a momentary silence, each became a carefully placed note in the music of diplomacy and survival. She learned to let others underestimate her, to appear delicate and compliant while quietly shaping alliances and negotiating outcomes. The mask she wore was seamless, her public persona both admired and underestimated, her private mind ever alert. Yet the danger of misperception was constant. Rumors circulated, some cruel, some exaggerated, and some carefully planted by rivals seeking to unsettle her position. Lucrezia responded with discretion, cultivating allies, showing favor selectively, and quietly disarming potential threats. She discovered that sometimes influence was best exercised in shadow, that silence and observation could achieve what confrontation never could, and that perception itself was a form of power. By the end of these years, Lucrezia Borgia had become more than a charming duchess. She was an observer, a subtle manipulator, and a quiet architect of her own survival. The court watched her with admiration and suspicion in equal measure, never fully grasping the depth of her awareness or the skill with which she moved unseen through webs of intrigue. In Ferrara, amid silver tongues and obscured eyes, Lucrezia was learning that mastery of perception was the most potent crown she could ever wear. The hand behind the throne. As the years unfolded in Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia discovered that influence was a subtle art, often invisible yet profoundly powerful. The glitter of the court, the grand banquets, the flowing gowns, the music spilling through marble halls, was only the surface of a deeper, intricate game. She began to understand that behind every declaration, every decision, and every ceremonial gesture lay a network of loyalties, favors, and whispered negotiations. And if she wished to survive, to thrive, and to leave her mark, she would need to navigate it all with both elegance and discretion. Lucrezia's skill grew quietly but steadily. She learned when to speak, when to listen, and when to allow events to unfold under her subtle guidance. Courtiers often sought her approval, intentionally or not, and she cultivated these moments with care, turning small gestures into meaningful influence. Gifts were given and received not merely as displays of wealth, but as instruments of diplomacy, each wrapped in expectation and obligation. She learned to read the subtlest shifts in expression, the smallest hesitation, and the softest inflection, using each as a compass to guide her actions. Even within the family, Lucrezia's insight became invaluable. She understood her father's ambitions, her siblings' rivalries, and the ambitions of the nobles surrounding her. By quietly advising, calming disputes, or subtly shifting conversations, she began to exercise a hand in the affairs of Ferrara, shaping outcomes while remaining outwardly graceful and unobtrusive. Her influence was felt more in absence than in presence, more in suggestion than in command. The young Duchess also recognized that power often wore the guise of ceremony. Every ball, feast, and procession was an opportunity to reinforce alliances, test loyalties, and communicate intentions without a single spoken word. She moved with composure, a model of refinement, yet her mind constantly mapped the shifting currents of courtly life. Where others saw only beauty and charm, she saw leverage and possibility. In these years, Lucrezia also learned patience. That true authority rarely demanded overt assertion, and that subtlety could accomplish what bold action might destroy. She began to cultivate a network of allies who trusted her discretion, and she understood that the appearance of innocence and compliance could protect her while enabling her to act decisively when the moment required. By mid-adulthood, Lucrezia Borgia was more than a duchess admired for her beauty and poise. She was a quiet strategist, a subtle guide, and a discreet architect of power within the court. The hand behind the throne was hers to extend, gentle yet unwavering, shaping events with precision, while the world saw only the elegant, composed woman smiling graciously in the grand halls of Ferrara. Veils of reputation. In the world of Ferrara, reputation was as fragile as the finest porcelain, yet as powerful as the sharpest sword. Lucrezia Borgia had learned early that the stories whispered behind closed doors could shape her life more forcefully than any official decree. The court spoke of her with admiration, suspicion, and sometimes envy, and the rumors that followed her were as persistent as the wind through the palace corridors. Every public gesture, every smile, every appearance in silk and jewels could be interpreted in multiple ways, and Lucrezia learned that managing perception was as essential as any act of diplomacy. Even as she moved with composure and grace, Lucrezia was acutely aware of the stories surrounding her family. The Borgia name carried both prestige and scandal, and many assumed that she, like her siblings, was caught in the web of intrigue and danger. Some whispered of poison, of betrayal, of seduction and secrecy, while others praised her intelligence and refinement. The young Duchess understood that her power often depended not on proving innocence, but on letting the world see only what she allowed them to see. Behind the gilded walls, Lucrezia's life was a careful balance. She cultivated alliances, mediated disputes, and exercised influence quietly, yet she also had to navigate the harsh glare of scrutiny. Every choice of attire, every carefully placed word in conversation, every measured gesture in a procession contributed to the persona she presented. The mask she wore became more intricate, a fusion of charm, discretion, and quiet authority. It allowed her to move safely through rumors while still exercising control over her household and court. The duality of her life became both a challenge and a tool. On one hand, she had to maintain the elegance and poise expected of a duchess. On the other, she needed to observe, calculate, and influence behind the scenes. Even the smallest slip in perception could be exaggerated into scandal, and Lucrezia's awareness of this truth shaped her every action. She became adept at reading not only her own appearances, but also those of the courtiers around her, anticipating intentions and guiding outcomes with subtlety. As the years passed, the interplay between reality and perception became central to her identity. The stories told about her could neither be fully controlled nor ignored, yet she learned to navigate them with skill. Her grace, intelligence, and quiet influence allowed her to retain authority even as the world speculated about her life, and she discovered that a well-managed reputation could be more powerful than open power. By the time Lucrezia reached full adulthood, she had mastered the art of veils. Each rumor, each whispered story, each public appearance was an element of a carefully constructed image, a mask she wore effortlessly. Behind the elegance and charm of the Duchess lay a mind capable of strategy, foresight, and discretion. In Ferrara, in the courts of Italy, and in history itself, Lucrezia Borgia would come to be remembered not only for what the world saw, but for the depth, subtlety, and quiet power hidden beneath the veils of her reputation. Crossroads of loyalty. As years passed, Lucrezia Borgia found herself standing at a crossroads of loyalty, where family, duty, and personal inclination converged like rivers meeting the sea. The Borgia name demanded allegiance to ambition, yet her heart sometimes yearned for connections and choices beyond the dictates of strategy. Each decision carried weight, for a misstep could ripple through the court of Ferrara, through her family's vast network, and even across the Italian states. The life of a duchess, she realized, was as much about navigating loyalties as managing appearances. Her father, now well established as Pope Alexander VI, continued to orchestrate alliances across Italy. Lucrezia, though far from Rome, remained entwined in the family's plans. Every marriage negotiation, every political correspondence, every alliance brokered with subtle gestures reminded her that family loyalty was a tool, a responsibility, and sometimes a burden. She could not act freely without considering the repercussions on the Borgia's vast web of influence. Yet Ferrara demanded attention as well. The Este family and their court watched her closely, measuring her words, her alliances, and even her silence. Her husband, the Duke Alfonso, expected both affection and political acumen. She had to maintain her role as a supportive consort while simultaneously asserting influence discreetly. Each interaction required careful judgment, balancing personal loyalty with broader strategy. In the quiet hours, Lucrezia reflected on the paradox of her position. Her name carried prestige, yet it carried danger. She wielded influence, yet she was bound by expectation. She was admired, yet scrutinized. The paths before her were often veiled, choices hidden beneath layers of etiquette, rumor, and power. It was here, at this intersection of duty and desire, that her skill at perception and subtle maneuvering became most vital. The Duchess learned to mediate tensions with gentle diplomacy. A soft word to one ally, a discreet gesture to another, a carefully placed note of encouragement or caution, each became a thread in the delicate tapestry of loyalty she wove around herself. She discovered that sometimes true power lay not in overt assertion but in quiet guidance, in shaping outcomes without ever appearing to interfere. As time went on, Lucrezia also faced the tension between loyalty to her family and the independence of her own household. She had to honor her father's ambitions, her siblings' schemes, and the expectations of Ferrara's court while still asserting the subtle authority that made her a respected duchess. In these crossroads, she became adept at choosing paths that balanced duty with influence, ensuring that her name retained dignity, her family retained power, and her own subtle strategies remained intact. By navigating these intersections, Lucrezia Borgia had transformed into a woman who could balance the pressures of family, love, and politics with poise. She was no longer merely the daughter of papal intrigue or the charming young bride of Ferrara. She was a duchess whose loyalty was measured, whose judgment was discreet, and whose subtle hand guided outcomes in ways both visible and hidden. At the crossroads of loyalty, she moved with precision, grace, and quiet power. The legacy unseen. In the twilight of her life, Lucrezia Borgia looked upon the court of Ferrara and the path she had walked with a quiet, measured pride. She had been born into intrigue, raised among ambition, and shaped by the expectations of a family whose name carried both reverence and suspicion. Yet through it all, she had endured, adapted, and subtly influenced the currents of power around her, leaving traces of her presence in places unseen, unheard, and often uncredited. Her legacy was not written in grand conquests or dramatic gestures. It was written in the careful cultivation of trust, the precision of diplomacy, and the subtle orchestration of alliances that ensured both the stability of her court and the security of her family. She had mastered the art of influence without domination, of shaping events from behind the scenes while maintaining an outward appearance of grace, charm, and compliance. In every gesture, smile, and word, she had balanced the delicate duality of perception and reality. Lucrezia's personal life had been a careful negotiation between duty and desire. Marriages, children, and family obligations intertwined with her role as a duchess, each requiring patience, discernment, and discretion. She had learned to assert authority without confrontation, to guide without appearing to control, and to protect both her household and her reputation with subtlety. The world saw the poised, elegant duchess, but few perceived the intelligence, strategy, and quiet determination that had guided her every move. Even history, with its tendency to favor scandal over nuance, could never fully capture the depth of her influence. Rumors of intrigue, poison, and ambition would linger long after her passing, but they could not erase the measured power, the skillful diplomacy, and the careful orchestration of appearances that defined her life. Lucrezia Borgia had learned early that perception could be as potent as action, and she had used it to shape a legacy both resilient and refined. In her later years, as she walked the gardens of Ferrara, observing the city, the river, and the palace she had helped shape, Lucrezia understood the ultimate triumph of subtlety. Power had not always required brilliance or spectacle. It often required patience, discretion, and the ability to remain unseen while steering events. The Duchess, who had been a daughter of papal intrigue, a bride in a political marriage, a young observer of courtly currents, and a discreet hand guiding outcomes, had become a woman whose influence endured long after the public eye had turned elsewhere. Lucrezia Borgia's life was a testament to the strength found in subtlety, the wisdom of discretion, and the enduring power of perception. Behind every public smile, every elegant gesture, every carefully cultivated reputation, there lay a mind capable of quiet mastery. Her legacy, unseen by many, remained woven into the fabric of Ferrara, the Borgia name, and the history of Italy itself. And in that, she had found the most enduring triumph of all, the art of ruling not only with authority but with the elegance, patience, and invisibility of a true duchess.